There are galaxies out there that look completely ordinary in visible light, but the moment we switch to radio waves, they suddenly sprout wings, and nobody fully knows why. If this sounds interesting to you, hit subscribe right now because we cover discoveries just like this every single day. Today we want to talk about a strange and fairly unusual type of galaxy that has only recently started to be discovered, and whose origin and exact properties were more or less unknown until some recent studies came along. We're talking about a subset of galaxies that astronomers now call winged radio galaxies, or basically galaxies that look like they have wings. These are galaxies whose shape is not easy to explain, and apparently they can only be seen properly with radio telescopes. In optical light or in other wavelengths, they look entirely different. To our eyes or to optical telescopes, these galaxies would just look like familiar shapes, spirals, or smooth elliptical blobs. But when we switch over to radio waves, these galaxies, and honestly the entire universe, seem to transform completely. We actually touched on some of these observations in a previous video because the radio collaboration known as LOFAR recently put together the largest radio map of the whole universe. That map contains millions of different structures, including, of course, these newly confirmed winged formations. Astronomers didn't really expect to find this because what they usually expect to find looks more like this instead, massive jets of plasma blasting out from the centers of galaxies, sometimes stretching for millions of light years. This is what we normally see because these jets are produced by central black holes, and some of them grow so big that they end up forming some of the largest structures in the known universe. Take Alcyone, for example, a giant radio galaxy about 60 million light-years across. We covered Alcyone in an earlier video, so check that out if you want more on it. For a very long time, most radio galaxies followed a pretty standard pattern, two giant lobes of gas sitting on either side of the galaxy, with similar shapes turning up again and again all across the sky. One of the most famous examples, and also the closest one to us, is the galaxy known as Centaurus A, whose radio loops have been studied for decades, even though it looks completely different when viewed in optical light. But over the last few years, astronomers have also started finding a rarer kind of radio galaxy, a strange little subset known as winged radio galaxies. Here's one of the most famous examples, discovered a few years back. These galaxies don't just have two loops, they seem to carry an extra pair, a fainter, dimmer loop that sometimes looks almost like wings. This gives them a distinct X shape, or sometimes a Z shape, which is exactly why we now call them X-shaped or Z-shaped galaxies. Until very recently, these were thought to be quite rare, and honestly something of a cosmic puzzle, because nobody really knew how these strange shapes were forming. But today we want to walk through a recent study led by Suman Kumar and released in May of 2026, which has expanded this entire class of galaxies by more than 1,000 new discoveries. Many of these newly found galaxies show even stranger shapes, and quite a few of them seem genuinely difficult to explain, although there are some possible explanations on the table. To understand how this forms, or even what it really is, we first need to briefly cover how radio galaxies normally build their jets. A radio galaxy is basically any active galaxy that happens to be extremely bright in radio wavelengths, and this brightness comes from an active supermassive black hole sitting right in its core. Astronomers call this an active galactic nucleus, or AGN for short. As the black hole feeds on surrounding gas and dust, it normally produces two jets shooting in opposite directions. As these jets travel outward, they sometimes slam into thin gas sitting between galaxies, especially inside galaxy clusters, which tend to be full of this in-between gas. That collision causes the jets to slow down, spread out, and form these giant glowing lobes that emit what's called synchrotron radiation, produced by electrons interacting with magnetic fields. That radiation is what we actually detect as radio emission. So basically, changes in the velocity and acceleration of these jets are what generate the radio signal in the first place. Normally, we expect a double lobe structure here, essentially two jets pointing opposite ways, almost like a kind of cosmic stereotype. So, the real question becomes, how exactly does a galaxy end up with wings instead of just two simple lobes? This represents a fascinating break from that classical symmetry. For decades, astronomers only knew of a small handful of these winged galaxies, and even those few seemed quite different from each other, possibly produced by entirely different processes. This new study, built on a massive search through LOFAR's data, has now officially confirmed more than 1,000 additional examples. This was only possible because LOFAR observes at very low frequencies, wavelengths that were essentially invisible to older telescopes built to focus on different parts of the spectrum. That mattered a lot here, because these wing structures seem to represent much older, more aged plasma that doesn't glow brightly and doesn't really produce higher frequency emission. So this kind of structure only becomes visible to telescopes sensitive enough to pick up these longer wavelengths. By scanning a massive data set of 4.3 million radio sources, the very same map we mentioned earlier, and by focusing specifically on structures larger than the host galaxy itself, anything bigger than about 20 arc-seconds across the sky, researchers managed to narrow things down to 200,000 initial candidates. Out of all of those, 621 were officially confirmed as winged galaxies, and another 403 were flagged as possible candidates still needing confirmation. This effectively tells us that winged radio galaxies are apparently not some rare oddball subclass after all, but instead seem to be a fairly common phenomenon scattered throughout the universe. Because so many examples have now turned up, researchers were able to split them into two clearer subclasses, the X-shaped radio galaxies, called XRGs, and the Z-shaped ones, called ZRGs. For the X-shaped galaxies, the wings seem to emerge directly from the center of the galaxy, and the study found at least 300 of these. These are likely shaped by a different process than the Z-shaped ones. The Z-shaped radio galaxies instead show wings branching off from the outer edges of the main lobes, creating something closer to a Z or S shape, almost as if the jets bounced off something and headed in a completely new direction. Researchers found 239 of these. Both types appear to be reasonably common, but they seem to come from somewhat different underlying mechanisms. Interestingly, the X-shaped galaxies tend to have much steeper spectral signatures compared to the Z-shaped ones. In simpler terms, that means the plasma inside X-shaped galaxies is likely older and more spread out, while the plasma in Z-shaped galaxies appears younger and more compact. So naturally, the big question is, what exactly causes this, and how does a galaxy end up growing wings like this? Right now, there isn't one single confirmed answer, but the study lays out three main possible explanations. The first is called the backflow model, and it's currently the most widely accepted explanation for the X-shaped galaxies. The idea is that as the jet travels outward, it eventually slams into a wall of dense intergalactic gas and gets deflected back toward the center of the galaxy. If the host galaxy happens to be shaped like an oval or ellipse, this returning plasma tends to follow the path of least resistance, usually along the shorter axis, and that's apparently what ends up forming these wing-like structures. So in this version, the jet basically bounces off something and spreads back inward. The second explanation is known as the spin flip, or jet reorientation model. Here, the wings are thought to be leftover relics from a past cosmic event. Specifically, when two galaxies merge, their central supermassive black holes eventually collide and merge together too. That violent collision can suddenly flip the spin axis of the resulting black hole, which sends the jets shooting off in a completely new direction. Under this idea, the wings we see today are just the fading remains of the old jets, while the brighter primary lobes are the newer jets formed after the merger. So essentially, there were two older jets before the galaxies collided, and now there are two brand new ones. The third explanation is a bit simpler. Maybe some of these galaxies just host two separate active black holes, each one firing off its own independent pair of jets in different directions. Exactly which explanation applies to which specific galaxy remains unknown for now, and honestly, none of these three models seems to perfectly explain every single example researchers have found so far, which means there is apparently still plenty of work left before we really understand what is going on here. Why this matters is that it tells us a lot about the violent, eventful history many galaxies and their black holes seem to go through. It suggests that a surprisingly large number of galaxies out there have gone through some kind of major disruptive event, something powerful enough to completely redirect their jets. The study also found that at least 16% of these winged galaxies qualify as true giants, measuring more than 2.2 million light-years from end to end, which is roughly 20 times larger than the entire Milky Way. One standout candidate, a galaxy named G1155+4029, measures nearly 6 million light-years across, making it one of the largest radio galaxies ever discovered. Finding so many giant examples among the winged galaxies suggests that whatever mechanism is producing these wings might also be connected to why these galaxies grow so dramatically large in the first place. In other words, this phenomenon seems tied directly into how supermassive black holes pump energy back out into their surroundings, something that, for many galaxies, ends up shutting down star formation almost entirely, eventually leaving them looking dead and faintly reddish. Understanding this connection helps astronomers piece together a clearer picture of how galaxies evolve and eventually stop forming new stars altogether, which is one of the bigger open questions in galaxy evolution research right now. This also matters because radio astronomy is still a relatively young and rapidly improving field, and discoveries like this remind us how much of the universe has simply been hiding from us at certain wavelengths the whole time, quietly waiting for the right kind of telescope to finally notice it. Of course, this is really just the first step, since researchers are now planning follow-up observations, especially in optical and infrared light, to see how the host galaxies themselves respond to and change alongside these unusual wing formations. For most of these newly found winged galaxies, only radio images currently exist, so comparing those radio observations against infrared and optical data could help scientists finally pin down exactly how these shapes form, possibly revealing clear signs of galaxy mergers or even hidden binary black hole systems hiding at their cores. For now, though, this remains one of the more fascinating recent discoveries from the wider universe, these strange winged cosmic structures that apparently are far more common than anyone expected. It's also a nice reminder that the more sensitive our telescopes become, the more we keep realizing just how much stranger the universe really is compared to what we used to assume. Once we learn more about these galaxies, we'll be sure to come back and talk through it again in a future video, since this story is apparently still far from finished.